Officer Steve Morgan's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he navigated the dimly lit streets, his senses heightened in this notorious neighborhood. Known for its shadowy drug deals and frequent bursts of violence, this part of town kept him perpetually on edge. His pulse quickened as a car with dark, tinted windows rolled through a stop sign without hesitation. Instinctively, Steve activated the flashing lights and sirens, signaling the driver to pull over. The vehicle obediently slowed and eased to the curb. Taking a deep breath, Steve braced himself for what might come next. In this area, he knew too well that a routine stop could quickly escalate into a dangerous situation. Exiting his patrol car with caution, his hand hovered near his holster as he approached the vehicle. As he reached the driver's side, recognition hit him like a jolt. Behind the wheel was Dr. Ava Johnson, a distinguished judge renowned for her unwavering stance against injustice and discrimination. Steve's heart pounded in his chest. This was no ordinary encounter. This was a high-stakes moment that could easily spiral out of control. Dr. Johnson lowered her window, her eyes betraying a mix of surprise and guardedness. Steve cleared his throat, feeling a trickle of sweat on his forehead. "License and registration, please," he managed to say, though his voice sounded tight, even to his own ears. Dr. Johnson's gaze sharpened as she handed over her documents. "Officer," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "I think there's something more pressing we need to discuss than just a minor traffic violation." Steve felt his stomach twist. He could sense the gravity of what was coming. Dr. Johnson continued, "Rather than issuing a ticket, perhaps it's time we address the deeper issues that led us to this point." Steve shifted uneasily, caught in a tug-of-war between following protocol and acknowledging the significance of the judge's words. The air around them grew thick with tension, heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of systemic issues that had simmered for far too long. As cars passed by, Steve realized that this stop had transformed into a critical juncture in both his career and the broader struggle for justice. Back at the station, word of Steve's encounter with Dr. Johnson spread rapidly, fueling a flurry of activity. Clusters of officers whispered urgently, casting furtive glances in Steve's direction as he walked to his desk, the burden of their expectations weighing heavily on him. "Morgan!" a stern voice barked. Sergeant Roberts stood in the doorway of his office, his expression hard and unreadable. "In here, now!" With a knot in his stomach, Steve followed. Once inside, Roberts didn't waste any time. "You know who she is. Don't let her play you. Stick to the rules. Got it?" Steve nodded, but uncertainty gnawed at him. Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Ava Johnson sat at her desk, typing furiously. She composed a social media post recounting the traffic stop, carefully balancing the facts with her perspective on the systemic issues at play. As she hit post, her phone began to buzz relentlessly. Messages of support poured in from activists, journalists, and allies, all rallying around her story. The post went viral in a matter of hours, and the hashtag #JusticeWithAva began trending, drawing national attention to the incident. Ava watched the surge of reactions with a mix of resolve and unease. This was no longer just about a traffic stop. It had become a flashpoint for a larger movement. Back at the station, Steve's phone vibrated incessantly as messages from friends and family streamed in, many expressing their support for Dr. Johnson's cause. As he read through them, Steve felt a deep sense of isolation. People he cared about, people whose opinions mattered to him, were aligning themselves with the judge. The weight of the situation bore down on him, leaving him caught between his duty as an officer and his personal connections. As the day dragged on, the pressure mounted. Steve found himself compulsively checking social media, watching helplessly as the narrative spun further out of his control. The comments ranged from demands for his resignation to calls for sweeping changes in law enforcement. He felt trapped, unsure of how to navigate the intense scrutiny and the conflicting expectations that now surrounded him. By the time his shift ended, Steve felt utterly drained, emotionally spent from the day's events. As he stepped out of the station, a chorus of voices from a gathering of protesters filled the evening air, their chants echoing ominously. Steve, trying to avoid their scrutiny, quietly slipped out through a side exit, a growing sense of isolation settling over him. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into something much larger, thrusting Steve into the heart of a brewing storm. Later, at his family's dinner table, he pushed his food around his plate, unable to shake the tension that hung heavy in the air. His brother Mike broke the silence, clearing his throat. "Steve, we need to talk about what happened," he said, his voice steady but charged with concern. Steve looked up, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Mike continued, his words cutting deep. "Your attitude towards black people, it's not right. Remember Marcus." The name struck Steve like a blow, unleashing a torrent of memories, vivid and raw. Marcus, his childhood best friend, with his infectious laugh and boundless energy, a boy who could turn the dullest of days into an adventure. They had been inseparable once. Steve and Marcus, dreaming big dreams together on sunlit afternoons, riding their bikes and plotting their futures. Marcus had wanted to be a doctor, Steve a cop. They had promised to change the world side by side. But then the memories darkened, and Steve found himself back on that night, the flashing lights, the shouting, and Marcus on the ground, pinned down by officers. Steve had stood frozen, powerless, as his friend was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. Mike's voice pierced through the painful reverie. "What happened to him, Steve?" Steve shook his head, the weight of years of ignorance and unexamined beliefs bearing down on him. He had never known what became of Marcus after that night. His family moved away, and just like that, their unbreakable bond was shattered. Overwhelmed, Steve abruptly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to find him," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. His family watched in silence as he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. In his car, Steve's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. Where would he even start? He pulled out his phone and hesitated before typing Marcus's name into a search engine. The results flooded in, social media profiles, news articles, until one entry caught his eye. Local doctor leads community health initiative. There, smiling back at him from the screen, was an older version of his childhood friend, successful and accomplished. Steve's chest tightened with a mix of pride and guilt. Despite everything, Marcus had realized his dream. Steve saved the contact information, his resolve firm. He would reach out. As he drove back home, Steve's mind raced. How had he allowed his views to become so distorted? How had he forgotten the injustice his own friend had faced? The confrontation with Dr. Ava Johnson, his brother's words, and the memories of Marcus all collided within him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he served. He realized that this was not merely about a single traffic stop or a long-lost friendship. It was about the sum of his choices and the opportunity to finally make things right. Meanwhile, across town, cameras flashed as Dr. Ava Johnson approached a podium, the press conference room buzzing with energy as journalists vied for position. Ava's face was calm, but her eyes were ablaze with determination. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here to address not just one incident, but the systemic issues that plague our society." She recounted her encounter with Officer Morgan, using it as a stepping stone to discuss the broader issues of racial profiling and police bias. As Ava spoke, she interwove statistics with personal stories, painting a vivid picture of the deep-rooted inequalities. "This isn't about just one officer or one traffic stop," she emphasized. "It's about a system that perpetuates discrimination and fear." Back at the station, Steve found himself in a cramped office facing his superiors. Chief Williams leaned in, his expression severe. "Morgan, this situation is spiraling out of control. We strongly advise you to distance yourself from it." "No comments to the press, understood?" Steve nodded, but deep down, doubt gnawed at him, more persistent than ever before. Steve's mind churned with thoughts of Marcus, Dr. Johnson, and the protesters outside the station. The burden of staying silent was growing heavier by the minute. Back at the press conference, Ava's voice wavered as she recounted a personal memory. "When I was 10, my father was wrongfully arrested right before my eyes. That day shaped the rest of my life." Her words gripped the room, drawing a hush. She continued, "I fought to become a judge, not just for myself, but for every child who has witnessed injustice and felt powerless." The air was thick with emotion as reporters rapidly raised their hands, eager to ask questions. Ava responded to each inquiry with grace, her answers both profound and provocative. As the conference drew to a close, it was clear her words had left a deep impact. Social media erupted with clips from her speech, the hashtag Ava for Justice quickly spreading across the nation. Steve watched the press conference on his phone, hidden away in a bathroom stall at the station. Every word from Dr. Johnson struck a chord within him, forcing him to face uncomfortable truths he had long avoided. His mind wandered to his own childhood, his friendship with Marcus, and the path that led him to join the police force. Ava's closing words echoed in his mind. Change starts with acknowledgement, with honest conversations, and with a willingness to grow. Something inside Steve shifted. The easy path of silence, as suggested by his superiors, no longer seemed viable. He stepped out of the stall, his decision firm. It was time to confront the difficult conversations he had been avoiding for too long. As Steve walked through the station, he knew his next steps might cost him his job, but remaining silent would cost him something far greater: his integrity. The city park was alive with energy, a sea of people waving signs and banners under the warm afternoon sun. The activist group had mobilized quickly, drawing thousands to their cause. At the heart of it all stood a makeshift stage, where Dr. Ava Johnson prepared to address the crowd. Steve Morgan stood on the outskirts, his police uniform making him stand out. His superiors had advised, attend if you must, but keep a low profile. But as he observed the growing crowd, Steve knew that staying silent was no longer an option. Ava took the stage, and her presence immediately commanded attention. "We are here today not to cast blame," she began, her voice strong and clear, "but to build bridges." She spoke of systemic issues, the need for accountability, and the hope for real change. As Ava continued her speech, a disturbance near Steve drew his attention. A group of protesters had recognized him, their faces twisted with anger. "That's him, the racist cop!" one of them shouted. The tension in the air grew as others joined in, their hostility palpable. Steve's heart pounded as the crowd around him became more agitated. He considered retreating but stood his ground. Then, Ava's voice cut through the noise. "Let him speak," she called out, catching everyone off guard. "If we want change, we must be willing to listen to all voices, even those we disagree with." The crowd hesitated, then parted, creating a path to the stage. Steve's legs felt heavy as he walked forward, aware of every eye on him. When he reached the microphone, he took a deep breath. "I've made mistakes," Steve began, his voice trembling. "I've held beliefs that I'm now questioning. I'm here because I want to do better. To be better." The crowd fell silent, stunned by his honesty. Steve continued, confessing his biases and expressing a sincere desire for change. As he spoke, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He talked about Marcus, his fears, and the flaws within the system he was a part of. When he finished, the silence was profound. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single clap echoed, followed by others, until the applause swelled. Ava stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Steve's shoulder. "This," she addressed the crowd, "is how change begins, with honesty, with vulnerability, with the courage to admit when we're wrong, and the willingness to do better." As Steve descended from the stage, he was met not with hostility, but with cautious respect. People approached him, some to share their stories, others to express gratitude for his honesty. For the first time in days, Steve felt a spark of hope. The road ahead would be tough, but he was finally ready to walk it. In a quiet corner of a small cafe, the atmosphere hummed with muted conversations, but at one booth, Ava and Steve sat in deep discussion. This was their third private meeting, a series of conversations that had started cautiously but were becoming increasingly open and honest. "Tell me about your first day on the force," Ava prompted, stirring her coffee. Steve leaned back, frowning slightly as he reflected. He spoke of his initial idealism, his desire to protect and serve. But as he continued, he found himself admitting how those ideals had slowly eroded, how the job had subtly changed him over the years. Ava listened with great focus, her probing questions pushing Steve to dig deeper into his experiences and motivations. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully, her voice softening as she began. "Now let me tell you about the day I decided to become a judge." She paused, a moment of hesitation before she shared a childhood story she had never spoken of publicly. It was about her father, who had been wrongfully arrested when she was young, and the overwhelming helplessness she felt as she watched it unfold. "I saw the system fail my family," she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. I promised myself I would change it from the inside. As she spoke, Steve found himself leaning forward, captivated by Ava's vulnerability. In that moment, he no longer saw her as the stern judge or the powerful activist, but as a person shaped by pain and driven by a profound sense of justice. For the first time, he truly grasped the passion behind her actions. When Ava finished her story, a heavy silence hung between them. Steve was the first to break it, surprising even himself with his honesty. I'm scared, he admitted. Scared of losing my job, my identity, but I'm more terrified of staying the same. He opened up about his own insecurities, the pressure to conform with his fellow officers, and the fear of being perceived as weak. Ava reached across the table and briefly touched Steve's hand. Change is always scary, she said, but it's also necessary. We can't grow without discomfort. Their conversation deepened as they shared their backgrounds, fears, and hopes for the future. As the hours passed, they discovered common ground in unexpected places, shared experiences of loss, the heavy burden of responsibility, and a mutual desire to make a genuine difference. When they finally prepared to leave, both sensed a shift in their relationship. They were no longer just adversaries in a public battle. They were two individuals navigating a complex world, each with their own struggles and strengths. Same time next week? Ava asked as they stood. Steve nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. As they parted ways, both knew that these conversations were more than just idle talk. They were laying the foundation for something that could lead to real, lasting change, both in themselves and in their community. The community center auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Ava stood at the podium, scanning the diverse crowd. Tonight, she began, we have a rare opportunity for open dialogue. She gestured towards Steve, who sat nervously on the stage. Officer Morgan has agreed to answer your questions directly. Steve approached the microphone, his palms sweating. The first question came swiftly. How can we trust the police after years of systemic racism? Steve took a deep breath, recalling his conversations with Ava. Trust has to be earned, he replied. We've made mistakes, and we need to own them. I'm here to listen and learn. As the forum continued, questions ranged from sharp criticisms to sincere curiosity about police procedures. Steve found himself speaking more openly than ever before, acknowledging flaws in the system and confronting his own past biases. Ava occasionally stepped in, offering legal context or challenging Steve to reflect more deeply. To his surprise, Steve's honesty seemed to resonate with many in the audience. One woman stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. I've been afraid of the police my whole life, but hearing you tonight gives me hope. Steve felt a lump in his throat as the weight of her words hit him. As the event neared its conclusion, a sense of cautious optimism filled the room. People who had arrived with anger were now engaged in thoughtful discussions. Ava beamed at Steve, proud of his growth and the impact they were making together. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the back of the hall. A group of men stormed in, their faces twisted with rage. Race traitor, one shouted, pointing at Steve. Another lunged towards Ava, screaming about corrupt judges. Chaos broke out as people scrambled to escape. Steve's police instincts kicked in. He rushed to Ava's side, shielding her as he assessed the threat. The extremists, a mix of white supremacists and anti-government radicals, were armed and clearly intent on violence. We need to get you out of here, Steve urged Ava, guiding her towards a side exit. But the path was blocked by panicked attendees, and they found themselves cornered as the angry mob advanced. Ava stood tall, facing the attackers with resolve. This is exactly why we need these conversations, she said firmly, though fear flickered in her eyes. Steve positioned himself between Ava and the approaching extremists, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no backup, only his voice and the newfound convictions he had discovered through his talks with Ava. As the tension reached its peak, Steve understood that this moment would shape not only the night, but the entire movement they had fought to build. The safe house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just fled. Steve paced the small room, adrenaline still coursing through him. Ava sat on an old, worn couch, her usual calm slightly frayed. Are you okay? Steve asked, halting his restless pacing. Ava nodded, but then let out a humorless laugh. I've faced hostility before, But nothing like this, she murmured, her gaze locking onto Steve's, searching for answers. How did we get to this point? When did simply talking become such a dangerous act? Steve sank into a chair across from her. Fear, he replied softly. Fear of change, fear of losing control. He ran a hand through his hair, reflecting on his past beliefs. It's easier to hate than to face uncomfortable truths. For a moment they sat in silence, both absorbing the gravity of the night's events. Ava broke the quiet first, her voice thoughtful. What happened tonight only shows how much our work is needed. Steve nodded, but she noticed the uncertainty lingering in his eyes. What's troubling you, Steve? She asked gently. He looked back at her, vulnerability plain on his face. I'm scared, he admitted. Not just of the extremists, but of what this means for my life, my career. The words spilled out now. I believe in what we're doing, but I've been a cop for so long. It's all I know. What if I can't change enough? What if I lose everything? Ava leaned forward, her expression serious. Change is never easy, Steve. But think about the difference you're already making. You're showing other officers that it's possible to admit mistakes and grow. That's incredibly valuable. Steve nodded slowly, but doubt still shadowed his features. But at what cost? I've already noticed the cold shoulders at the station. Some guys won't even look at me anymore. Then we need more allies within the force, Ava said, her eyes gleaming with determination. You're not alone in wanting change, Steve. There must be others who feel the same but are too afraid to speak up. We need to find them, support them. As they continued to talk, strategizing ways to build a coalition within the police force, Steve felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. They spent hours discussing next steps, identifying potential allies, and figuring out how to counter the extremist threat. By the time dawn broke, they were exhausted but resolute. They had faced violence and fear, but instead of retreating, it had only strengthened their commitment to their cause. Whatever comes next, Ava said as they prepared to leave the safe house, we face it together. Steve nodded, a blend of determination and gratitude in his expression. They stepped out into the early morning light, ready to continue their fight for change, no matter the obstacles. The movement grew quickly, with Ava and Steve at its heart. Security meetings, police sensitivity training sessions, and public forums became a regular part of their lives. Their unlikely partnership caught the media's attention, sparking nationwide conversations about police reform. Ava stood before a crowd at City Hall, her voice echoing across the plaza. Change isn't just about policies, she declared. It's about changing hearts and minds. Steve stood nearby, nodding in agreement. He had become a symbol of transformation within the force, inspiring other officers to speak out against injustice. But as their public profiles rose, so did the difficulties. Steve faced increasing hostility at the precinct. Whispers trailed him through the hallways, and his locker was often vandalized. One morning, he arrived to find his desk cleared out, relegated to a cramped corner. They're trying to push you out, Ava remarked during one of their intense strategy sessions. Steve, with a somber expression, nodded. Some of the guys think I'm betraying the Brotherhood, selling them out. Despite the mounting pressure, Steve remained steadfast. He began organizing informal gatherings with younger officers, openly discussing reform ideas and addressing their concerns. Gradually, a small yet determined group of allies began to emerge within the department. As their movement gained momentum, the criticism against Ava and Steve intensified, evolving into outright threats. Forced to tighten their security measures, they pressed on, their resolve only hardening with each small victory. Then a bombshell dropped. A whistleblower approached Steve, handing him evidence of a cover-up involving Officer Thompson, one of Steve's closest colleagues. The documents exposed Thompson's role in a brutal assault on a minority suspect, which the department's higher-ups had buried. Steve felt the weight of betrayal. Thompson had been his partner for years, a man he trusted with his life. But the evidence was irrefutable. We have to go public, Ava urged when Steve shared the files with her. This is exactly the kind of abuse we've been fighting against. Steve knew she was right, but the thought of breaking the thin blue line filled him with dread. He would be seen as the ultimate traitor, burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. Yet, as he looked at the haunting images of the battered victim, he knew there was only one choice. As they prepared to release the information, Steve was torn between terror and determination. This was the point of no return, the moment their campaign for justice would truly begin. The morning air was crisp as crowds gathered in front of the police station. Ava and Steve stood side by side, facing a sea of protesters, supporters, and the ever-present media. This was the culmination of their efforts, the pivotal moment in their fight for reform. Steve stepped forward, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Today, we expose a truth that's been hidden for far too long," he began. He recounted the incident involving Officer Thompson, laying out the evidence of brutality and the subsequent cover-up. Gasps and whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. As Steve spoke, he noticed his fellow officers watching from the station windows. Some appeared angry, others ashamed, and to his surprise, a few nodded in agreement. He ended his speech with a powerful call to action. "It's time for real change, starting here, starting now." Ava then took the stage, outlining their proposal for a civilian oversight committee and greater transparency in police operations. Her words were met with cheers from the protesters and thoughtful nods from city officials present. The aftermath was swift and intense. Officer Thompson was suspended pending investigation, and several high-ranking officials were forced to resign. The department was thrown into chaos, but amidst the turmoil, a spark of hope ignited. In the following days, Steve was approached by officers he never expected to see on his side. "We're with you," a veteran cop said quietly. "It's time we cleaned house." A group of younger officers asked to join Steve's reform meetings, eager to be part of the solution. Meanwhile, Ava found herself thrust into the national spotlight. She was invited to speak before Congress, her passionate advocacy for justice resonating across the country. Her journey from a traffic stop victim to a catalyst for nationwide police reform was hailed as an inspiration. As the dust began to settle, Steve received unexpected news. The newly appointed chief of police, who had stepped in after the scandal, called Steve into his office. "Morgan," he said, "we need men like you in leadership roles. How would you feel about heading up our new internal affairs division?" Steve was stunned. This was his chance to effect real change from within, to ensure that incidents like Thompson's never happened again. He accepted, knowing the road ahead would be tough, but necessary. In a final press conference, Ava and Steve stood together, a symbol of the bridge they had built between law enforcement and the community. "This is just the beginning," Ava declared. "We've shown that change is possible when we have the courage to confront hard truths and work together." As they looked out at the crowd, a mix of civilians and police officers, all united in their desire for justice, they both felt a profound sense of accomplishment and hope. The journey had been grueling, filled with personal and professional challenges, but they had endured. Steve turned to Ava and extended his hand. As they shook hands, it was more than just a gesture. It was a promise to continue their work, to keep pushing for a fairer, more just system for all. The road ahead was long, but they were ready to walk it, step by step, together.